First of all, thank you all for coming. We're very touched and moved that so many of you are here this evening, especially because obviously today we all have many, many things in our minds, and it's even hard sometimes for us to concentrate on what we want to concentrate on. And so it's especially generous of you to come here this evening to hear about good work. The events of September 11th put everything into perspective, and we certainly are not going to claim that the work we're talking about tonight, the book and the project, are directly linked to the issues raised by September 11th, yet they will be in our mind, and at the end of the presentation we'll probably talk a bit about how our own ideas have changed as a result of the events of the last few weeks. Our goal tonight is to tell you about the Good Work book and the Good Work project. It's an endeavor that's 6 years old. It's one that we're very excited about. The three of the authors and the several other people who've been working on the project who are with us this evening. It's also a very complicated project with a set of ideas which, for better or for worse, cannot be summarized in a soundbite. And indeed, I hope somebody in the audience, when we get to the question session, will ask us to talk some about the complexity of the project, because we've got to start out with the more fundamental aspects for our presentations. The plan this evening is that first I, and then Bill Damon, and then Mike Csikszentmihalyi will speak for the podium for about 15 minutes each. Then we may have a little banter back and forth, and then we'll open it up to you all till about 7:30. So, to begin, this is a bit difficult because some of you know us very, very well, and some of you wouldn't know which of the three of us is which. We're all social scientists, we're all psychologists, and we wear that hat in this endeavor. We've all been interested for many years in what we call extraordinary achievement. Human beings who, for whatever reason, do things that are truly remarkable. We've known each other for decades. In fact, I got to know Bill when I was a graduate student and he was an undergraduate, and my professor, Roger Brown, said, I got this very smart student, you ought to come and hear him talk. And that was back in 1966-67, and Mike and I go back almost that long. But we never worked together until 1994, when we all spent a year at California at a think tank called the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. And our goal there was to talk about what it meant to be extraordinary in the area of leadership, which I had studied, creativity, which Mike and I had both studied, and what it meant to be a moral exemplar, a person who really lives his or her life in terms of a very strong set of ethical principles, which Bill had worked on. We had no obligation except to talk with one another, which was not an obligation, it was a pleasure. But we hoped some kind of a project would emerge. We had no idea whether one would emerge or what it would be. Each of us ended up having a somewhat different motivation for being involved in the Good Work project. I'm going to mention mine, and my colleagues may mention theirs. In my own particular case, I was struck in November of 1994 when there was a new Congress elected, one that subscribed to the so-called Contract with America. You will remember the name Newt Gingrich, I hope. I won't put any adverbs there, even though I'm in Cambridge. And at that time, people were saying, you know, the market is the best mechanism for handling all endeavors of a human nature. And basically, whether it's business, the arts, science, law, medicine, government should get out of the way, regulating agencies should get out of the way, let's let markets regulate things. Now, I didn't have any strong views about the market and business. I look to my friend Warren Bennis for that kind of insight. But it seemed clear to me that all sorts of things that I cared about were best not left to the market. For example, should education, lower or higher education, only be available to people who can afford to pay high fees? Should medical care only be available to people who can basically meet what the traffic will bear? Looking at my friend Mark Wolf in the first row, the judge, should defenses only be available to people who could afford them? A total market model would say yes, and this seemed unconvincing to me. So we talked a lot, and one of the things we talked about was whether extraordinary achievement, what we now call excellence in various domains, could be yoked to a sense of ethics, to a sense of responsibility, to thinking about the work that you're doing, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a business person, journalist, geneticist, philanthropist, whether the work that you're doing can be both excellent in quality, but also extremely reflective about its implications for the wider society in which that work takes place. So that was the admittedly inchoate conversation we were having 7 years ago. As a tribute to the inchoateness, we initially called our project Humane Creativity. Nobody knew what it meant. No funder wanted to fund it. No publisher wanted to publish it. So we are somewhat influenced by the market. We decided to go for more Anglo-Saxon kind of name, and so we call our project Good Work. And we thought a lot about which, we used the word domains or professions that we wanted to study first. And we eventually decided to study two domains which are very, very important in the world of the 1990s and the world of 2000. The profession that tells us what's going on in the world, that gives us information about what's happening every day. And nowadays, many of us are listening every hour to what's going on. And that profession is journalism. Journalism deals in what Richard Dawkins calls memes. Memes are the ideas which we hear and remember and pass on. We also thought about another kind of information, a kind of information which has become incredibly visible in the last 50 years and in the last 5 years, and that's genetic information, the genetic code. The people who know about genes and the people who can tell us about our heredity, who can tell us about cloning, about stem cells, about whether we can change our genetic makeup through genetic engineering or recombinatorial DNA or even more radical kinds of experimentation, are dealing with information that's every bit as important, gene information. Now, another lamentable thing, we wanted to call our study Memes and Genes. But we found out that 95% of people in publishing had never heard of one or the other, depending on what kind of publishing they did. And all of those who heard it hated it. So in-house we use the word meme genes. We're now studying theater, and so in-house we talk about memes, genes, and scenes. But you'll never see a book with that title. The question we've asked, and those of you who are not researchers may not realize how long it takes even to get the question right. It's taken us about 6 years to get the question. The question we're asking is, how do people who want to do good work which is both excellent in quality and responsible, how do they succeed or fail in doing so at a time when things are changing very, very quickly, when market forces are incredibly powerful, and mark this phrase, there are no counterforces, because September 11th may have changed that. And finally, when our whole sense of time and space has been radically altered by technology such as the web. So you are a journalist, a geneticist, a lawyer, a doctor, any kind of a worker. You want to do good work that's excellent and responsible. But what do you do when everything's changing so quickly and market forces are so powerful and you don't even know about what's going to be instantly telegraphed around the world? We organize our inquiry through interviews. We have interviewed over 100 journalists, over 100 geneticists, and probably 600 or 700 people in other domains by this time. And when we interview people, we talk to them for at least 2 hours. Several of our victims are in the audience. We transcribe these interviews. These interviews talk to people about their goals, their values, the obstacles they encounter, the strategies they develop. We pose ethical dilemmas for them. They're very wide-ranging interviews. And then social scientists, we transcribe them. The transcripts are often 40 or 50 single-spaced pages, and then we pore over them over and over again until we can make qualitative and sometimes quantitative sense out of them. And there are too many folks to mention, but we've had a meeting this week of 15 or 20 people who've been working on this project, and they're the ones who've been doing this incredibly important analysis of our data. And we organize the questions for purposes of summary into three basic topics, which we will call the three M's. The three M's are mission, model, and mirror. The first question which we ask people in so many words is, what's the mission of your work? What do people in your profession try to accomplish? What is most valuable and sacred to you? The model question is, whom and what do you admire? If you're not sure what to do, who do you think of as a role model? And because it turns out to be very interesting, we also ask them not only about mentors, but what we call tormentors and anti-mentors, because often those have more influence on people than the mentors. And the third question is what we call the mirror question. As a worker, when you look at yourself in the mirror, are you proud of what you do, or are you vaguely embarrassed? And then the M-squared question. If all the people in your profession were to look at yourself in the mirror and see themselves, what is the mirror, what is the reflection of the profession at all? And I see my friend Sarah Lightfoot, who's been asking these questions ever since the good high school, which used the same word all the way through her study of respect. So mission, model, and mirror. Probably most people here are not journalists or geneticists, but everybody faces good work in his or her, everybody faces the issues of good work in his or her profession. And one of the ways these come up with are dilemmas. So let me mention some dilemmas. You're a teacher. You've got a notion of what you want to teach. A mandate comes out from the state. You've got to teach this stuff in this way because graduation is dependent upon it. Ted Sizer knows this dilemma very well. What do? What is your obligation to different entities? You're a lawyer. Jim Friedman, Mark Wolf here are lawyers. You have a certain set of ethics, but you're working for a multinational corporation. You've got to go to a distant country, and you're told in that country you've got to bribe. It's just the way it's done. What do? You're a physician. You have the Hippocratic Oath. You know it for many, many years. You work for an HMO, and they said you've got to see every patient for 6 minutes. Moreover, you can't tell them about certain cures because we won't pay for it and we'll just get in trouble. What do? Fay Weldon, artist, writer. Ike Williams deals with people like that. Bulgari jewelry store comes to her and said, we'll pay you money if you mention Bulgari several times in your next novel. So she creates a novel called, is it the Bulgari Connection? Something like that. Is that good work? I'm not going to run through all the professions, but if you don't face the dilemmas of good work in your profession, it probably means you're not paying enough attention because they arise everywhere, and in a sense we all have to stand up and be counted at those times. I want now to say just a word about genetics and then turn it over to Bill, who's going to talk about journalism. Of course, in our book, Good Work, we talk about the general ideas of the project, but we focus on journalism and genetics because of the great importance of these two kinds of information. Information's in our mind, information in our body. At the time of our interview, which was 1998, 1999, we talked to 100 geneticists, including the ones who are Nobel Prize winners and household names. Genetics turned out to be what we call a very well-aligned domain. Keep that word in mind because journalism at the time of the interview was a very poorly aligned, a very misaligned domain. When a domain is well aligned, it means all the principal parties involved in that domain pretty much want the same thing. And it frees practitioners to do good work if they so choose. So, in genetics, we talked to people who worked for universities, people who worked for for-profit companies. We talked to genetic therapists. We found out about their values, what was important to them. But we also monitored in for-profit companies what did the shareholders want from those companies. Because if it's a for-profit company, whether it's a newspaper or a biotech company, they want to have profits. And we paid attention as well to what we call the stakeholders. This is Tony Blair's phrase, the people in the wider society who have a vested interest in genetics research. It so happens that everybody in this equation, the practitioners, the companies, the shareholders, all want the same thing. They all want to live long and be healthy. There is really no controversy. So when you ask geneticists about what's valuable to them, they say we want to be able to do our work. We're curious. We want to understand how genes work. We want to be able to do this openly. We want to be able to tell the truth and publish it. We want to be able to share information freely. And all of these values, at the time of our interview, were supported by the other stakeholders in this enterprise. In a well-aligned area like genetics, there isn't much of a difficulty of doing good work. And indeed, the geneticists whom we spoke to, in contradistinction to every other domain, I think, cannot wait to get up in the morning because they're so excited about what they're doing and they feel they can do it in the way they want it, using their own values and so on. I want to turn this over now, with an elegant segue, to Bill, who's going to tell us about a rather different picture in the area of journalism.
In the field of journalism, if you start with the public need for journalism, there probably has never been a time when people are more dependent upon information from the media, from the mass media. The world is becoming closer and closer together. There's a lot of things that are happening, as we know, all over the place that the only source of information that we could possibly have is some reporter, some stringer or reporter who's in Pakistan or who's in Europe or who's able to send a satellite image to us across through the internet or through the television set. And also, as we know, people in communities now are less and less out in the town square or sitting on the stoop exchanging information. People are dependent upon what they read, what they see on the television. So you'd expect that there'd be a kind of a wave of public appreciation or a sense of respect for the mass media. But in fact, it's, as probably as everybody knows, the journalism at this time is one of the least trusted professions in our society. Any public survey over the last 10 years shows at least 2 out of 3 people saying that they don't trust what they read, they think it's biased, they think it's too sensationalistic, they don't like watching it, they believe that they're not getting the whole story, or even that they're getting disinformation. And at the same time, the producers of the news, namely the people who make decisions about what's aired, what's covered, think that they're giving the public what they want because they are driven by the desire for market share. So there's a real disconnect between what the public say, meaning dissatisfaction, and what the media producers believe the public wants to buy. And this, one of the ironies in this situation is that the market-driven sense in the news business, in the news industry, at least until very recently, has been driven by a quest for profits that have been substantial. The news industry has not been, in recent times, a broke, underfunded industry. It's in corporations, for example, the big corporations like GE, which own NBC, the most profitable division in the entire corporation could well be the news broadcast. They start at 22% profit margins and go up from there. And so the drive is to see how much more profit you can squeeze out of this, because there's a sense that this could be never ending. 22% this year, 24% next year, 30% the year after. And there's a sense that the sky's the limit. And how do you increase profits? One way is by cutting expenses. And that's exactly what's happened. Foreign news has been defunded. A lot of newspapers don't even cover it anymore, or rely on the same 2 or 3 sources, AP or Reuters, that cover it, so you get the same sources giving everyone the same information, so you don't get the chance to cross-check or to get diverse opinions on this. And investigative reporting, which is expensive, is now kind of rationed out. A mid-sized newspaper may be allowed to do 1 investigative story a year, or maybe some reporter may be allowed to do 1 in his or her whole career. So, as you might expect from within the profession, mirroring the sense of public disaffection from outside, you have a great sense of pain, especially from people who have been in the field for a while, who entered the field with high hopes of giving the public the information that they need to live their lives, uncovering important stories, scandals, or setting the truth right, getting beneath the deceptions of officials who are trying to deceive people. All of these kinds of things that traditionally have moved and excited journalists, especially young people who are entering the field, have become harder and harder to do because people have fewer resources. When people do stories that are in depth or have some insight, often the stories are edited, they're cut down, they're only given a little bit of space. The editorial instruction is to sensationalize things, to play up the conflict, and often to distort or to give the wrong impression or to tell something out of proportion. So Howard talked about the mirror test as being a sense of somebody's moral compass. One of the interview tests that I often think about is, you might call the tears test, which is how many of your subjects are brought to the verge of tears when they're talking about what they do. And it's amazing, it's striking that these kind of hard-bitten, tough, cynical journalists are so moved and saddened when they talk about what the gap is between their ideals and the reality of their day-to-day work, that in fact they break into tears from time to time. There's a lot of ways that people could react to this and do react to this, people working in the profession. Of course, that's what we're interested in. And some leave. We call this a domain departing strategy, which is kind of a bit of jargon, but it could be honorable. They leave, they might write books or go into teaching or do other things. They can't stand it anymore. But that's, and we write about some people that have done that, but that's really not the heart of our interest, because we have identified and did identify a number of people that have found ways to stay within the field and to manage to succeed, to manage to do good work that is consistent with their own best sense of what they ought to accomplish. It's not easy, but they find ways to do it. To give you just a couple of examples, one of our subjects was Ray Suarez. Now, he was working for a television station, a local station in Chicago, when he was instructed to do things such as cover a video game that had just come out. The family, one family had sued the company because the kid had developed seizures when watching the video game. And he was told to produce a show on this that would show the dangers of video games to kids. It would really bring a lot of parental eyes to the screen. And he did a responsible job of researching this and found out this was one case out of, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of games out there. He went to the producer and he said, look, this is not exactly a proportional story. It's an unusual case. The story was produced. This is what he had to do. That was his job. He said he would have left the profession if that had been the way of the only option he had. He eventually migrated to NPR. He and a group of other people contributed to building up NPR into a very respectable news outlet. And not only does NPR, I think as a lot of people here might agree, do pretty good job reporting, and so does Suarez, it's commercially successful. In fact, it's the fastest growing news outlet in the country right now. The listenership is growing by 70% a year. That's quite a trend. So this is a story of somebody that didn't compromise, didn't say, I have to do a small little niche somewhere and not really get through to the public, but I didn't have to compromise my standards either. And this is exactly the kind of people that we've been interested in. We've looked at some people who are very famous and very successful. We were interested in Ted Turner, who we interviewed, who started, of course, CNN, which it was a domain expansion, a new format, 24/7 news, and was successful, obviously commercially successful, but they did a lot of good reporting at least until Turner sold it. We looked at Tom Brokaw. We looked at a lot of people who are very prominent who have had good stories. We also looked at a lot of people who you'd never hear of, but it's very moving to go out to Tulsa, Oklahoma, which I've done, and visit the Tulsa World, and see, as you go around the desks, a picture of Ed Murrow on the wall, or a quote from Walter Lippmann. And you see this all over the place, all over the country, in print, in broadcast, in internet now. There are internet channels, MSNBC, where you get people who have been trained at the Chicago Trib or the LA Times who really care about what they're doing and who go to the mat on it and who will not compromise, and who at MSNBC who won't let Bill Gates into their newsroom. And I'm serious about that. So there is a cadre of people who are hanging in there. Now, what are they hanging in, or what does this mean, and why are they doing it? And here it's I think a very stirring case of people who have gone back to the very roots of the profession, the very mission that journalism has evolved over the centuries, and they are true to that mission. And it's a sense of carrying on a flame that has been lit, and that they don't want to let that down. And of course, the mission includes something that any public-spirited person would care about. The mission traditionally has been to tell the truth, to give the public the information it needs in order to make informed choices about their lives and about their society. So it's a critical support to the democracy. And journalists are aware of this. Journalists talk about this. They think about this from day to day. A lot of them do. And so we've traced a lot of these ideas back to as I said, the evolution of the domain itself. In this country, it goes back to Ben Franklin, who was a printer. And in those days, journalists were printers. And I actually wanted to just read a little quote from Ben Franklin to give you a sense of where it all started in this country, and also where it's gone. He wrote, "Printers are educated in the belief that when men differ in opinion, both sides ought equally to have the advantage of being heard by the public, and that when truth and error have fair play, the former, truth, is always an overmatch for the latter. Hence they," meaning printers, this is the part I like, "cheerfully serve all contending writers that pay them well, without regarding on which side they are of the dispute." So it started very much as a commercial enterprise, and the idea that's often repeated that there's freedom of the press for those that own it. But now it's evolved. It's gotten a long way from that, and there have been ups and downs and problems and so on. But in the course of American journalism, there's been a continual sense of progress towards the sense that more and more groups ought to have access to this, more and more voices ought to be heard. And what's gone wrong, or what has created the pain and the sense of despair that so many people feel? There was a transition between a time when a lot of people refer to as a kind of a golden age in the field, which was kind of beginning with the progressive era, the late 19th century, the earliest 20th century, which came to maybe an apogee at the time in the 50s when Murrow and other people were writing, and when families owned newspapers by and large. And the families were part of communities, but they certainly had their biases, and they had their things that they were not always fair about. But they had some sense of reputation within the community, some sense that they were serving the public in some way. And one of our old families that talked about this, who had sold out, said, in those days we made 8-10% profit. You make a nice profit, enough to make a living, and you do good work. Who owns newspapers now, and who owns broadcast stations? The answer really, and this is an interesting issue, it's become in a sense more democratic, because who owns it? We own it. It's spread out. It's Wall Street. It's mutual funds. It's depersonalized. It's owned by people who make decisions about buying and selling according to bottom line profit margins. And those decisions, nobody takes the responsibility of saying, well, is this company publishing this or printing this or airing this? It's what's the rate of profit in this year? Should I sell it or buy it? And that's created a set of incentive conditions that has become a serious obstacle for people who are trying to think of the broader public interest. Now, I think a lot of us, and so you get a balance. So you kind of have journalism in the balance, in a sense. You have a group of people who are working in the field who are inspired by an ideal, and you have a set of incentive conditions that are working in opposition to that ideal, and which will prevail. I can't read the future, but I will close by saying, a lot of us nowadays, in the recent weeks, are thinking of life before and after September 11th. And I actually just came back from New York. The three of us were just in New York, and it's kind of an amazing experience to fly into New York 3 or 4 weeks after this enormity that happened, and see life in New York City, because it has come back, and people are out in the streets, and they're going to the Broadway shows. Maybe not 100%, but it's remarkable, the resiliency and the sense that people say the things we value we are not giving up so easily. And I kind of think of that as a sort of a metaphor for what could happen in journalism. And in fact, since September 11th in journalism, I'll tell you a very interesting story. It's a very short story, because we're not very far beyond September 11th, and who knows what the course of events will be. But what I mentioned before about the profitability of the news industry, that has all changed recently. Now, the coverage is very expensive. People are sending people off to northern Afghanistan, to Europe. The foreign news teams are being built up again. The analysis is being built up. This is tremendously expensive at a time when advertising is way down right now, and these networks and these newspapers are losing money hand over fist now. But they're doing it. They're doing it, and the owners are making statements such as, well, the public needs to know this. We have a responsibility. The word responsibility has come up over and over again. It's the first time I've heard that word from Fox News in the whole time we've been studying this field. Now, what does this mean? I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish and say this is going to shape the future necessarily, but it does give you a sense that that even above the ranks of the people actually working in the field, and even among people who control some of the decisions, that the spirit is still alive and still can be brought to life. So we at this point are moving in our own work beyond the book even to try to find ways to intervene in the field of journalism. We have an educational program, a traveling curriculum that we go out and try to incite both the managers and the reporters to remember the old traditions. And I think almost as an article of faith, but maybe more than that, we are hopeful about the future of the field, even though it's come out of a period of desperation.
So, unfortunately, the book only has two professions or two domains to talk about, and both have been talked about, so I'm left with really commenting on the covers of the book, more or less, or about what my colleagues have not talked about, and I will try to pick up on some of the themes that have been left out. This is probably not such an exciting panel. I mean, we are used to Crossfire and other places where people jump at each other, and we don't do that. We do talk essentially with one voice, even though we may have different accents, but slightly anyway. But we do see the situation pretty much in the same way, and that makes for less dramatic podium behavior, but I hope we can build on each other's ideas by looking at them over time and cross-checking with each other. Essentially, I think what we found, to summarize both what Howard and Bill were saying, what we have found is that in these two professions, in genetics and journalism, there is an alignment between what the professionals themselves want for themselves and with the traditions, at least the best traditions of the field. We didn't find many people who were cynical about what their job should be like. But at least in journalism, we did find a disconnection, a lack of alignment between what both the old traditions, or at least the traditions of the golden age of journalism, and the desires of the professionals, and the conditions under which their job was done. So I would like to talk about these three threats to alignment that we found, which are not only true of these two professions, but I think of many others. And they were already alluded to by the previous two speakers. But let me repeat that the three main threats that we found have to do with the rapid change of technology, with the change in ownership patterns, and finally, in both cases, with the dumbing down of the information that is being looked at by or provided by either geneticists or journalists. In technology, the rapid change in the collection and transmission of information has made it almost impossible for people to be reflective about what they do in journalism. It made them almost impossible to be able to put information in context. For instance, one of the things we found among television journalists is several of them mentioned that when a new producer comes on a news station, one of the first things he does is throw out the tapes from the previous management, and essentially destroying the memory of that particular unit. And that's done partly because each producer wants to impose his or her own slant or style more on the information, but in the process makes it very difficult to be able to check, to put things in context, and so forth. There is, as you know, in television, especially in California, where Bill and I come from, there are entire TV shows now dedicated to showing from helicopters car chases, which started, I think, with the O.J. Simpson case, but it has become a genre of reportage. And there, the convention that originally the stations adopted was that there would be a 7-second lag between the feed from the video and the transmission, so that if something really gruesome happened, they could stop and not show the flying bodies and so forth. Unfortunately, this convention that was adopted was never really followed, and so you are beginning to have this instantaneous experience, which is not edited, it's not put in context, it's not reflected on, and this is one of those, is one of the many ways in which the news technology has created a situation where professionalism is difficult to conduct. Now, in genetics, we have, this is not yet the case, but there have been troubling signs, especially among genetic counselors, who were one type of people that we interviewed, who felt that in their position, which is intermediary between basic science and the use of the science by customers, that there too there were pressures building up with the especially as biotech companies are trying to put on the market faster and faster new products and new techniques, and the demands from the customers are increasing, that this time between a discovery and its implementation is getting shorter and shorter. So essentially, in this whole area, I think our book, Good Works, is trying to pose a question which we think is very important, namely, how do we tell healthy developments in technology, that is healthy memes or healthy genes, from those that are really deleterious for human well-being? Who is called to make these evaluations? We find that, for instance, among geneticists, there is a complete disavowal of responsibility. They say, this is not our business. Society should make up its mind how to use this technology. So the scientists are washing their hands of the results, and they are putting the responsibility back into the political, social arena. However, most of us are not capable to understand and evaluate really either the dangers or the advantages of these scientific advances. And I think as the rhythm of change is increasing, more and more of the safeguards have to be built in, otherwise the outcomes may be really dangerous there. The second threat to alignment, to good work, is what Bill mentioned in the media, is these changes in ownership patterns. And we have over and over found middle managers or even editors in newspapers, in good newspapers, who are throwing up their hands because they know that they are not being evaluated by the owners in terms of how good the job they do, but they are being evaluated whether they can keep the profit margin above 20%, even though a generation ago 7% was considered a good return. And again, here, our book raises this question of who should own the information, genetic or cultural, the news. Do we need some forums, institutions, or safeguards for making sure that the market isn't the only way in which these resources are going to be allocated by? And this is not a trivial question, because in many ways it's a counterintuitive question, because it points to the fact that as ownership has become more democratically distributed, some unintended consequences have arisen, namely that in the past, in the time of the press barons, the Pulitzers and the McCormicks and Chicago Tribune and so forth, these people were not unbiased. They were opinionated. They were egomaniacs sometimes. They distorted the news, but at least you knew who was responsible for it, and there were certain limits that they didn't want to cross, because they weren't running these papers only for profit. They were running them because they themselves have invested and felt that they were representing a public voice. Now, what is happening is that nobody feels ownership in that sense anymore of the media. They feel we own, all of you probably, most of you own a little bit through your pension plans or whatever, a little bit of Time Warner, a little bit of Disney, a little bit of that, and you don't have to check what they're doing. You're just checking the returns at the end of the year, and that's the only transaction between this diffused ownership and those who are doing the work. And the managers know that if they don't return the 20%, 22%, they're going to be out of there. Somebody else will come there. So even though they know what they want to do and what is the right thing to do, they feel that they can't do it. So that was the second question, are there certain limits to the market in terms of ownership here? The third point I want to raise is this dumbing down, namely the way in which both the rapid change of technology and this distribution of ownership leads, in a sense, relentlessly towards lowest common denominator, because, unfortunately, while all of us are interested in tragedies and airplanes falling, and we are also all interested in royal weddings and celebrities to a certain extent, fewer and fewer people are interested in the background and the consequences and the responsibilities of actions that are the real information that we should be getting if we want to lead a well-informed life. So there is a kind of a pyramid of audience looking for complex information. It's getting smaller and smaller at the end of complexity. And if the technology changing and the market forces are aligned the way we are talking about, namely misaligned, then the consequence of that is that if you go for a large audience, you have to provide the kind of information we all want and do less and less of those that fewer and fewer people are actually interested in. So our book, Good Work, raises the question, can genes and memes be preserved from trivialization under these market-driven and quickly changing conditions? This hasn't yet been a problem in genetics because there has been really no great influence yet of genetics and human on the genome. But we all hear about designer babies, and we all hear about the kind of issues that people want out of genetics, which again, if it's left uncontrolled, it's going to drive towards the lowest common denominator. So given all these three problems to alignment, we try to then describe what a good worker can do given these threats to alignment. And again, both Howard and Bill mentioned many of those, but I will just hit them again just so we remember what they are. And the first one was the expansion of the domain. And this is, for instance, one of the things that Bill is doing by talking to journalists in a formal kind of curriculum sense of expanding the knowledge, restating the values of the domains so that newspapers, TV stations can do some reflection, self-assessment, and realign their procedures, their practices with the values of the domain. Eventually, this question of where should the lines beyond which technology will not be allowed be drawn. And if you raise that question, you immediately are thought to be some kind of a neo-Luddite. But just think, that has become such an immediate reaction when you try to ask questions about limiting technology. And yet, I mean, those poor Luddites were, weavers in the Midlands who were protesting against mechanical looms, which was not a huge earth-threatening problem. But we are dealing with really life-threatening issues here. Besides adulteration of the truth or the uncontrolled meddling with the human genes, we can bring in nuclear stockpiles and all the other ways in which technology presents dangers. So I think this question of finding limits or dealing with limits is one of the issues that we must confront. The second one is reconfiguring the field, which is starting new ways of professional associations, organizations, which again was mentioned here, from public radio to CNN, but also political action in trying to limit ownership of genes and news, finding specific niches where good work can be done, perhaps outside of the momentum of the mass media. These are all issues in reconfiguring the social organization of the field, not just the values of the domain, which was the first one. And finally, the third one is taking a stand. And again, here we talked about many individuals who eventually said, okay, I can't do this within this situation, I better resign, I leave. We have quite a few journalists, not geneticists yet, one or two who had to do that in biotech companies. But basically, taking a stand is a very difficult thing to do, especially if you have a family and you. But in my study, for instance, of 100 creative individuals, I was surprised that 12 of them had been jailed sometimes in their life for standing up. And this was not just, resigning and quietly. This was standing up until you were taken into jail. So that is the last recourse of having to stand up, and I hope that many of us won't have to take that last step of when you can't look in the mirror anymore and you just have to leave. And we won't do that if we are able to hold on to the principles of the domain, if we can live in a field that allows us to live up to those values. Then you can do good work without having to give up on your job. So these are some of the themes of the book we have written, but for better or worse, we are planning several others that we hope to go deeper into these issues, look at other professions, other fields, other domains, and bring to the collective audience that you represent this concern for doing good work professionally and in life. And it is something that I hope we can discuss now in greater detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill and Mike. I'm sure all of us want to both say more and refute, but I think it's time now to open it up. We'll ask you to do two things: speak very loudly and be succinct. You may comment or question, but if you can't hear you or you talk too long, you'll see the less benign aspect of the moderator. Well, actually, the question was a relationship between spirituality and good work. We are in the process of preparing to write a book on the topic of meditation and contemplative practices. We've been doing a whole separate study on that, which it would be premature to give the results of. But there are two things which we noticed. One is that even though most of the people whom we interviewed in these two domains do not have religion as an important part of their lives as adults, many of them talk about the importance of religion or early belief systems when they were young. The second thing is that with young people, we've been looking at young people in journalism, genetics, and several other fields. Religion has been a very dominant theme, much more so than we thought. And with one group, which Mark Wolf has been chairman of for many years, the Schweitzer Fellows at Harvard and other universities here. These are medical fellows. Religion was a theme with just about every single person. And this raises the general question of what might motivate people to be good workers. And one of the things that came out today in a discussion with a journalist is that there can be transformations in people, either because of something which happens in your own life, a road to Damascus kind of experience, or something that happens to the domain. In the case of journalism, things in a sense get so bad that people really say we've got to try to change this. Or in the case of September 11th, something happened to the whole society. And what's come out not only in my own family, but in discussions everywhere, is people are saying, what am I doing? Is this really what I'd be doing with my life and my job? And that's kind of an existential issue, and many times people turn in a more spiritual vein at that time. Any of you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the reason we started writing this or doing this new study, contemplation and meditation, was because even among our professionals, we found quite a few of them who use practices, spiritual practices, as a way of organizing their life, and which surprised us because none of us are card-carrying spiritualists, but it was a real interesting aspect.
Yes, back there? Yeah, striped shirt, checked shirt, yes. Yeah.
By having a lot of wrong questions first, I think.
Yes, we have a long record of all of our discussions, even going back to 1994, 95. And if someday there's somebody's interested, we could make that available. But it takes a long time in research to figure out exactly what you're asking. And then it takes a long time to figure out how to talk about it publicly.
Of course, we may not have the right question anyway, but this is the one that felt right to us at the time, after many others that weren't quite right,
Yes?
Let me say something about the first part. let me say something about the first part. Maybe Mike will say something about the social engineering critique part. It's a good question about. You're absolutely right in suggesting that what we were really interested in was how people are experiencing their work, and that was our database. That we were interested in individuals who entered these fields with certain goals, and then day to day were either able to accomplish them or not. And as I said, in the case of journalism, a lot of times feeling a lot of pain. The conditions that Mike mentioned were conditions that they themselves talked about when they said, we are really frustrated or really confused, or we really feel that our work lives have the danger of getting out of control. There are things that we can't control. Things are speeding up so fast. The new technologies are creating a demand for instantaneous reporting, and so we don't have time to check our facts, for example. We don't have time to do that in-depth investigation, or we don't even have time to tell the story in a way that's contextualized. And the market forces I mentioned. So these were the conditions that they themselves experienced as being very difficult to overcome. And then what we tried to do was to say, look, there are different ways of responding to those conditions. Some are by quitting. Some are by becoming cynical. There were people, I didn't mention the case of Matt Drudge, but he essentially said, screw journalism. He's the guy that runs the Drudge Report, the internet site that played a big role in the Clinton scandals and so on. Gets a lot of hits. His ethic is, I'll just report whatever I hear about. If 70% of it is right and 30% of it is wrong, well, that's not a bad ratio. That's pretty much a quote from him. We don't need editors. We don't need verification. We don't need any of this trappings, the standards of the field, the trappings of the tradition. And that's another way of responding to it. But what we're saying is, and we're not being relativistic here, there are better ways of responding to this. There are standards that matter. There are traditions that have evolved that are important and that are necessary for two reasons. For serving the public interest, which is the social responsibility, for serving the mission, and for the person, for what kind of a person you want to be, the sense of moral identity, the sense of being able to look in the mirror and say, yeah, I like what I see, I like what I'm doing, this is the kind of person I want to be. So that's how those mega conditions translate into personal experience. Now, whether we're making a social critique or not, I'm not so sure about that, but maybe Mike can talk about that.
Yeah, I agree that, see, if we were just reporting what the people said, you would get things like this. For instance, this is from an anchor woman on TV. The primary mission is always to get ratings, to get the viewers to watch. And how do you do that? All depends upon what the viewers in the particular market want to see. If they want to see violence, then you do a lot of crime stories. A shooting here, a homicide there, a child abuse case. This is a business, just like any other business. And what do businesses do? They make money. So we could have filled the book with hundreds and hundreds of these things, you know. But then, you know, we are also trying to abstract and make sense of these things. Yeah? And these seem to be, these three meta conditions seem to be the most representatives of these hundreds of pages of pained, anguished reports that people gave about their own jobs, about their own lives. So, some people may have come up with different obstacles and maybe interpreted them differently, but that's your job to decide whether this is the best or not. You know, if you look at the same data.
Two hands are very visible. 1, 2. Yes, first you.
Mr. Damon, earlier in your speech you said that Lord of Benjamin Franklin was all team the importance of showing both sides of the debate, and yet in the same speech you insinuated Fox News was irresponsible for CNN was, and that Drudge is somehow, I think the article referred to that the media should quote drawn out Matt Drudge or
I think we get your question.
But no, my question is, do you think that it's, do you find any ethical scruples in, say, for example, lecturing the media on objectivity when you yourself have taken such a clear partisan stance?
I think that's a good question. First of all, the idea, we don't lecture the media on objectivity. Even the media themselves don't really think that objectivity itself is the most desirable end, because people, I think, are aware that everybody that does a story has an angle on it. They have an interest in it, and the idea of being perfectly objective is not really the point. But there is a point which has to do with verification, because there is such a thing as truth. There is such a thing as whether or not something actually happened or not. Now, you can take the approach that if I report whatever gossip or whatever comes across the transom, a lot of it's going to be right, and you can even say that most of it will be right, over 50%, let's say. And when you do that, two things happen. One is that, a lot of you may be the first person to disclose or to break a story because you've done it quickly, and nobody can compete with that, especially if you have to check the facts. The problem is that when you're wrong, and let's say you're wrong 20% of the time, I'll give you credit. I believe that's less than Matt Drudge said he would be satisfied with. Let's say you're wrong 20% of the time. In those 20% of the cases, you can actually damage a lot of people. You can do a lot of damage. You can do a story about a school superintendent who stole money from the school till, let's say, and turns out that didn't actually happen. And then you publish the retraction a week later, but you've damaged that person's reputation, and you've damaged the credibility of your reporting and of the news media. Well, I'm not. Well, let me say this. First of all, I'm not exactly a media watchdog, but CNN for a period of time, when Tom Johnson was running it, was very careful and went through all of the rigmarole that people do, and there's a whole science here. It's much like the science of cleaning your test tubes. There's a whole science of verification where you check you check and recheck on a number of sources. You don't use anonymous sources. You do all this stuff. There's a methodology that's been developed. It tends to filter out a lot of the inaccuracies. Now, whether or not CNN's made mistakes and all that, sure, but for a period of time they were acting relatively responsibly. The New York Times even does a better job. I mean, there are levels of quality. It doesn't mean anybody's perfect, but there are levels of quality.
Okay, let's take some more questions. Back there, yep, Ken.
Yeah, I think those who are following the principles, the rules of the game in their profession, get the same satisfaction as Jensen or Semmelweis or Harvey. I mean, because they know that they are playing by the rules, and they know that this is an important game. This is an important goal. It's when they begin to cut corners and look too much for external rewards, that's when I think the satisfaction from the work itself goes down. Yeah, but
And as Mike pointed out in the book, when professions begin to attract people because of how much money they can make, rather than because of the intrinsic interest of the problems or the service that's being carried out, then, to use his metaphor, the game is lost. Let's see. All the way back there, standing up. Yeah. This is like Groucho Marx. When you say moral identity, it means Bill.
I hope talking about translation, I hope I'm able to translate that question. I think what you mean is, does the kind of things that we look at really have any kind of application beyond the circles that we were looking at, especially if you go to a foreign place like South Africa? And I will just say that I think we do think that we were looking at some very fundamental standards and principles. If you're doing science or doing journalism, either one, truthfulness is important. And whether you're doing it in South Africa or you're doing it in Boston, you got to get the truth out, and you got to be fair. And that's another one: fairness to people, fairness to the public. Sense of public responsibility. Now, these things are going to look different in different places, and maybe even the ways that you go about them are going to be different. But I think that there is a certain kind of homogeneity wherever humans live in their need to have truthful communication, their need to have benevolent, fair relations with one another, and these are the things that we focused on.
Yeah, and all the people from non-traditional backgrounds that we interviewed were right on the money in terms of the values of the profession. I mean, there was no question about the values, but they had access to different cultures or different constituencies, and their contribution was to bring the problems of those constituencies, minorities, into the profession, and therefore enlarging the scope of what was known or what was true, but it was not questioning of the basic values.
Now, there's no question if we have the opportunity to conduct this work in other cultures, and that's our intention, we will learn a lot. But my own feeling is that every person doing work anywhere is going to face these same questions. Indeed, the book is dedicated to John Gardner, no relation, who turned 89 yesterday. And his most famous quotation, which I will get the gist of in his book Excellence, which came out 40 years ago, is an excellent society needs excellent philosophers and excellent plumbers. Without them, neither the theories nor the pipes will hold any water. And that's... Yes, back there? Yes. Yeah, go ahead. Speak up, and we don't have much time, so... In journalism, it was very easy to get a balanced design because in the last 10 years, the newsrooms have really opened up. We found in what Mike called non-traditional populations a somewhat greater tendency to talk about journalism as evening things up in the society, giving voice to the voiceless. That was the major difference in journalism. In genetics, it's much harder to get a sample that's balanced. Most of the scientists are male, and most of them are Caucasian or Asian. I would say that there, the major difference was how much individuals felt that they themselves could affect what's going on in the domain. And that's a question of power. Let me pack into the question that was asked much earlier. I don't know if the questioner is still here. We are talking about the individual, but we are interested in bringing about changes in society. And I think there are two useful quotations to keep in mind. Margaret Mead said, "Never condemn a small group of people who get together to start something new. Nothing important in the world has ever begun any other way." And Jean Monnet, a personal hero of mine, the architect of the European Union, said, "All things begin with individuals, all things end with institutions." We hope that enough individuals banding together within and across professions can bring about changes having to do with technology, market, dumbing down. But it's got to start with people like us. It's not going to start with some magical thing, though events like September 11th do shake up the filings, which is good. Let's take a couple more questions. Yes, standing over there, and then down here in the front. Yeah.
Well, the first thing we found is that a lot of people told us, including a lot of editors that we interviewed, that the role of the editor was changing, and that the editors now were being kind of moved out of the editorial division and being put more with management, including even their own pay incentives and all that kind of thing. But they now have one foot in the advertising department, and they felt a lot of some discomfort with that, and certainly the reporters felt a lot of discomfort because they didn't know whether they were speaking with a friend or an enemy when they were talking about that. But you're right. The editors of the type of the old school of Bill Kovach, and who was a person we were working with on the educational part, operated exactly the way you mentioned. But that's been a diminishing role that's been weakened.
Yeah, focus groups and consultants are getting more power than the editors because they are driven by these market forces. So,
and the most radical critique, of course, are the Matt Drudges, the internet journalist, who really says essentially kill all the editors, let the public be the editor. All the public needs is information. Let them sort it out. Let them figure out if it's truthful, if it's interesting, and so on. That is a certain vision. That is a vision that, in a sense, is a radical attempt to either create a new tradition or to destroy the old one. I'm not sure which. But this is one of the things that's making it difficult for people such as yourself who are relying on some of the old trappings of the field.
2 more questions, and then we'll have to break up the public session. The gentleman over there, and then Vu. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think we are certainly not saying that we are going from a golden age into the age of iron and then the Stone Age is back there. What we're saying is that every generation, every historical period has certain problems that come out either as a result of changes in technology, society, etc. You have to revisit these basic questions over and over. You know, it's not like it's getting worse, but unless you catch these problems before they become endemic, before they become really destructive, then civilizations who had greater prominence than ours have collapsed. Historically. So it's not things do change, and we are essentially in the position of making those changes less dramatic and more towards the growth of the human spirit rather than towards an age of barbarism again. And that's what the position we are in, not that it's getting worse.
Last question from Vu. Yeah. You mean journalism and genetics? Well, we didn't have a completely free slate because we always have to study things we're interested in and we get funding for. But our analysis was, that information, what it is and who controls it, is tremendously important now, always was important. And while there are many professions which are involved with information, the ones which stock our mind provide the means, and the ones which tell us about our bodies and in the future will be able to change those of ourselves and our progeny, have a unique kind of power. But we're actually hoping to look at 12 different domains. We won't mention it all. Look at children of different ages. We've been working with kids as young as 10 all the way up to what we call trustees, people who are very senior. We have some work going on in Scandinavia and Latvia. We're looking at different cultures. We're looking at issues like lineages where practices get passed down from one generation to another, topics like religion and contemplation. It's a very complex edifice. That's what all the books that Mike referred to will eventually be about. We hope some of you will talk about this after leaving here tonight. Some of you will go out and buy the book. Some of you will ask about good work, especially now at a time when everything is up for grabs. I want to thank Mike and Bill for visiting my place. Thank you all for coming this evening. And I want to say a special thanks to members of my family who are here, and one person without whom I would not be here, and that's sitting in the first row, my mother. Good night.